Thank you, Courtney, and welcome everyone. My name is Dan Berlin, and I'm here with Paul.
I'm Paul Kahn.
Well, thanks again for coming to our presentation on visual design principles. I'm an experienced research director here. Paul's an experienced design director, as Courtney said, and we do our best to lead the beard production here at MadPow, as you can see from our pictures. So for today, we're going to be chatting about visual design principles, from perception through the eye all the way through to cognition and how best to do this. Talking about being pattern seekers, as humans as pattern seekers, and then we're going to dig into the perceptual variables, which allow us to make these intuitive designs. We'll talk a little bit about color use, and throughout the presentation, we have design examples in order to show some examples on these theories that we're talking about, these psychological theories. So first off, we are pattern seekers. So before we dig into some of these theories and such, why are we even talking to you about this today? Why is this important? And these perceptual tasks that we're going to be talking about today really drive those designs of intuitive interfaces. The whole point of experience design is to make sure that things are intuitive and hopefully aesthetically pleasing. And the way that we do this is by designing in such a way that users don't have to think about seeing a pattern.
And the whole concept of patterns of information is very central to information design and a very important aspect of graphic design and industrial design, because it's the pattern in the information. It's the pattern of information that creates understanding in our mind.
And we're going to be talking a lot about psychology of perception today, because all good design is based on this, even bad design, because there's a reason that it's bad design.
At the same time, I think one of the lessons that I learned from my partner and great design teacher, Christoph Lenk, that is often difficult for many designers to understand, is that good design doesn't occur on a piece of paper and it doesn't occur on the surface of the screen. It occurs in the mind of the user, and we have to keep our focus on designing for what happens in a person's mind.
And the way that this happens, and what we're going to be talking about today, the way we receive this information is really by perceiving differences on the screen, differences in data, differences in displays. And we're going to be talking about these different differences and what we're good at and what we're not so good at.
The patterns that connect our perception to the information, these are the pathways of accessing these differences. And the more clearly we can recognize that the information that we're receiving is coming from this perception of differences, I think the better we become at being able to design for the user.
And in his seminal book, Information Visualization, Colin Ware summarizes this very nicely in a single sentence. The perception of a pattern can often be the basis of a new insight. So we're change detectors, we're pattern seekers, and by seeing patterns in data and in interfaces, we can gain insights. So, digging in a little deeper here. The overall goal of experience design is to create intuitive interfaces. And intuitive is a word that gets thrown around a lot. And so what does intuitive really mean? So there's this a psychological theory called dual process theory. And this is that there are two systems, for lack of a better term, that perform our perception. Now, the System 1 and System 2 was coined back in 2000, and as Kahneman says Daniel Kahneman says in his new book, Thinking Fast and Slow, and we're gonna steal it for today, that System 1 and System 2 are really personifications of these ideas. They aren't real psychological systems or physiological systems, but they give us that good context in order to talk about this in such a way. And System 1 is that instantaneous recognition that happens before anything really hits your cognitive mind. And System 2 is that active thinking, it's cognition. System 1 is everything that we can do intuitively without thinking about it. System 2 is where we start really thinking about things and having to use our brains to get insights.
So when we're designing interfaces, we're trying as best we can to take these two into account, and where appropriate, use the system one to make things intuitive, easy to grasp, easy to focus on, and at the same time, in terms of our mastery of the visual design principles, attractive in harmony with a person's senses.
And we're going to be concentrating the discussion on System 1 today, because that's the system that really gets at intuitiveness and, generally speaking, at aesthetics. System 1, by designing correctly, as it were, we'll be taking advantage of the mind's strength, of System 1's strengths, and avoiding the weaknesses of System 1, which we'll be talking about what those strengths and weaknesses are. And overall, the goal here is to not confuse System 1. That will make it intuitive. That will hopefully make it aesthetically pleasing as well. All right, so that's a lot of high-level theory. Let's get down and dirty a little bit. So that's interesting. Give me an example. Well, here's a good example for you. With the image on the left, it's the task on for each of these pictures is to find the red circle. The one on the left is very easy to do so. The red circle pops out, doesn't require much thinking. The one in the middle requires a little more serial processing, a little more thinking by System 2 in order to find that red circle in a sea of red squares. And then finally, in the third picture, you can forget about it. It's pretty tough to find that red circle in a sea of red and blue and squares and circles. It takes a lot more serial processing. So the one on the left is indeed intuitive. It takes the least amount of effort to grasp those differences. And again, it's all about those differences. So how does this apply to design work? Circles and squares are interesting in theory, but how does this work in design? Well, take a look at this design that we did for Jaws and Diabetes Center, and look at the things that pop out at you as instantaneously recognizable. So we've got the smiley face on the right side. Without really thinking about it, you know that that's a happy smiley face. The red and green. Now, in an American culture, red is bad, green is good, so that's fairly instantly recognizable as good and bad indicators. The arrows also help that out. The bar graph here, we can tell that that's about 30%, 35% just by looking at it without much thinking. And the blue text. And now, again, some of this is learned. Some of this does involve learning. But by looking at this ever so briefly, you can see that the blue areas are interactive areas. These are spots that you can click on in order to interact with the screen.
And there's a number of things in this example that we'll break down a little bit in the later examples, such as differences in size. So we've both got a color and we've also got difference in size. As Dan mentioned, we've got a color and we've got an arrow indicator. We have a number of cases where you can reinforce the difference that you want someone to notice. But the most important issue in terms of how this is done is to develop consistency and be thoughtful about the way you use these differences to signal the user.
So backing up a little bit, we've already started talking about the mind, System 1, System 2, but let's back up a second and talk about how we actually see these things, starting with the eyes. And overall, we are change detectors, and it all starts at visual space perception at the eyes. When light enters the eye, goes through the cornea, the iris and your lens change shape so that the light can be focused on the retina. You're already responding to change. When the rods and cones, when the light hits the rods and cones, they're detecting changes in light and color. Again, change detectors, and the rods and cones are sending the signal back to your brain based on changes in the light. And then finally, we are able to perceive three-dimensional space based on retinal disparity. Retinal disparity is the distance between the difference in the angles of the two eyes, and that allows us to see in three-dimensional space. So it all comes back to these different changes. We, as humans, we are change detectors, and on this particular page, that's why the red words are standing out to you. They're much different than the black. So what are the steps of visual cognition here? It's essentially a three-step process, oversimplified a little bit. Perception we just talked about. That's the actual light entering the eye and getting translated into electrical signals for the brain. And we're going to respond to changes in contrast and hue, brightness, and the color palette. It's all based on change entering the eye. And we're detecting these both physiologically and psychologically as the signals get changed into electrical signals. And then we enter the world of preattentive processing, or System 1. Figured out back in 1980 by Treisman and Gillade. And this is what can be processed in under 250 milliseconds. This is the intuitive information that when we look at something, we know what's going on. We can identify it very quickly without thinking about it, and typically happens in under 250 milliseconds. And this is a parallel process, or bottom-up processing. We can do we can perceive multiple things at once. We can with preattentive processing. Then we move on to System 2, or cognition, and this is the serial top-down processing where there's we'll take up some mental capacity. This is the active thinking, and we can typically only do this one thing at a time. So whereas System 2 can process things in parallel, multiple at once, System 2 is all about one thing at a time. And that's why we want to rely on System 1 for our designs and not overload System 2.
It's also why many of us tend to differentiate between things that take no effort, mental effort, and things that are hard or take effort or require focus. That's also a way of distinguishing between these two.
So digging ever so slightly more into preattentive processing. Again, it sits between perception and cognition, and it allows us to see patterns without really having to think about it. Take a look at the images on the right side. Now, if I were to ask you to find the columns, or what columns stand out to you in these two, you'll point out that the squares on this one are different than the circles on the other side, and the red is different than the blue on the left side here. And one is easier to perceive than the other, and this comes to the hierarchy of these variables. Some are easier to process than others. In this particular case, the difference between the colors is a lot easier to perceive than the difference between the shapes of the same color. And this gets into some of the things that we're good and not so good at. We're much better at telling the difference between color than the difference between shapes. And that's when we're going to start digging into these preattentive variables, which we'll talk about in depth in a moment. But proximity, similarity, the Gestalt laws, which you may be familiar with, which we'll talk about in a bit. And you're always going to have overlapping variables. You're never going to see for the most part, you're never just going to see a line out in space. That line is going to form the edge of your phone, that you're perceiving the whole object. To perceive the whole object takes System 2, but System 1 will take care of that line. So with these overlapping variables, that's how we see as humans. And feature integration theory is one of the theories on how we deal with this by the same people who came up with preattentive processing. Again, how we put all these variables together in order to perceive the world around us.
So let's try and take some of these concepts that are based on this remarkable psychology research that's been going on for the last couple of decades and see if we can integrate it with some other traditions that also have a lot of impact on our understanding of how we think and how we perceive. This lower diagram is taken from a very good recent book by Alberto Caro, The Functional Art. And what he's doing here is he's coming up with a model for what's known as the Data Information Knowledge Wisdom Hierarchy, or the DIKYW hierarchy. If you think of the left-hand side as where we start, what you see, the outside world, it's made out of a certain amount of unstructured information. And as a communicator, your job is to extract from that the information or the data that you need for something, code it into structured information, that's what's going on in the center here, the communicator, and then pass that in a structured fashion to the audience who can turn that into knowledge, and depending on the quality of the information, perhaps turn it into wisdom by decoding it based on their memories and their experiences. All of this more or less correlates with the perception, preattentive processing, cognition 3 steps. So as designers, one of the most important things is to recognize that we can learn from much of what's going on in science, in cognitive psychology, in social anthropology, and in neuroscience. We can recognize what Dan has stated, that we're pattern seekers, that we order the visual patterns that we recognize. The examples over here on the right will come up again as we talk about some of the Gestalt elements. We also have to understand that we store visual patterns, and these patterns that we store, the face of someone we remember, location that has some meaning to us, has a great deal of influence on our expectation when we see something. So as we are doing design, we have to become attuned to the fact that what we see is very strongly influenced by our expectations, which is why it's so important to create personas and to understand the audience that you're designing for. At the same time, we shouldn't take the psychology laws as though they've just invented something new. When you study typography, as most people who are in the design business do at some point in their career, they're exposed to 5 centuries of typographic practice, and there's many aspects of typography that are tremendously clear illustrations of some of the principles that Dan was just talking about. Particularly when you think about legibility, that legibility is essentially achieved through spacing, and in sophisticated typography, such as what you see in the illustration on the lower left, you're always balancing character spacing, space between the characters, word spacing between the words, and line spacing, the space between the lines. And it's by controlling all of these that you can create the differences that allow people to be able to process language to make things legible. Essentially, color, in this case we're just talking about black and white, color comes from size and weight. So this example on the right, which is a specimen by William Caslin, a famous 18th century type designer, seems to have different colors. Some of it looks blacker and some of it looks lighter, and all of that is achieved by the size and the weight of the type. Essentially in typography, you're always using white to expose the black. At the same time, we can learn a lot of relationships between these psychology laws and the traditions that have developed in industrial design. The 2 examples that I'm showing here are both by Christopher Dresser, who was a designer in the late 19th century and is often credited with being the first industrial designer, someone who consciously was designing for manufacturing products. And in his work, he established several things that we see right up through the current day, which is an emphasis on symmetry, rhythm, and repetition to make things both functional and attractive. The example on the left is an emblem that was placed over the door of the workshop, the studio where Dresser did his work. On the right, one of his more famous designs that's in many of the museums around the world. That's a toast rack, something that you use for putting your toast up in the morning. But at the same time, you see how much of his work was clearly inspired by the fact that he had studied botany and knew a great deal about natural forms. So these same principles happen when you look at a design where you begin to see how the colors, the 3 color patterns that we have here, immediately group the blocks. The positive and negative space of the rectangles also draw your attention into making it easier for you to focus on individual parts. And over on the right, again, another indicator indicating that 66% of some task has been accomplished or something's been accomplished, also broken down into units so that we have this reinforcement of 3 different levels of signal here, the number of units that are easy to perceive, and the color difference. We also have to keep in mind that part of our perception system is a process that we follow where we scan, we filter, and we interpret differences. This photograph will mean a lot of different things to different people depending on what they recognize and how they would filter it. I think all of us would probably filter the external shapes. We can see the different signs. Depending on our cultural background, the English language words may immediately come out to us, and the words that are in Hebrew and in Arabic just become a kind of background pattern, or if we're an Arabic reader, those Arabic words will stand out. Other types of symbols, such as the arrow and the differences in color, will hit different people different ways.
Yeah, and as I mentioned earlier, while we try to do this intuitively, it is still based on your experience. So as Paul said, different things will pop to different people. It's the whole nature nurture. A lot of this is nurture. Some people may recognize the seal of Jerusalem here, and then make the intuitive guess that is pointing to something that is dealing with the Jerusalem government, and as it is, it's the Urban Improvement Department. So it is based on our past experience, not just on our physiological perception. So an example of going from an older design to a newer design, from a less intuitive design to a more intuitive design, is something from this health design challenge from last year. What we have on the left is an older system of maintaining patient records information, and on the right is a redesign of that. And just by looking at it, you can tell that the one on the right is easier to understand. But let's pick it apart a little bit and understand why that is. On the left side, the header is marked by the hash sign, which isn't necessarily intuitive. All it does is really make demographics stand out a little bit. On the right side, we have all sorts of ways to make headers stand out. The person's name is much bigger than the rest of it. Again, change detectors. By making it bigger, we're just seeing a change. We know that that's more important for some reason. Or bold, for that matter, bigger and bold. Your continuity of care document, present state, medical history, these all stand out. Additionally, on the right side, we're using the standard forms for a U.S. address and phone number. On the left side, the address is all one line, and that wouldn't stand out to someone who's familiar with that method. And in general, by using the spacing and the segmentation on the right side, it's a more intuitive read of this data. And it's important to point out that just because something is intuitive doesn't necessarily mean that it's aesthetically pleasing, that you like the way it looks. Aesthetics are really a matter of taste based on cultural preferences. Again, that nature nurture, aesthetics tend to be a little bit more nurture. What you grew up with will dictate what you like, but you don't want to confound system one. Something will have a higher chance of being aesthetically pleasing if the person doesn't have to sit and think about trying to put the image together in their mind. And the example here is the iPhone versus a Windows phone. Both may be perfectly intuitive, but based on aesthetics and other factors, people may like one more than the other. So, and that's what we're trying to do in our designs, is to combine that intuition for the interface, for the interactions, with aesthetics. We want it to be both intuitive and aesthetically pleasing. And with this example here is the Hot Seat app that we developed. And the idea here is that it would get you out of your chair and do some activity, and not you're just not sitting in front of your computer working all day. And looking at this design, we can see that it is intuitive and aesthetically pleasing, or hopefully it is. Again, with the line, we can see very quickly that we've done about 40% there. Based on our knowledge of how apps work, we will know that these are buttons down here, that these are arrows to go back and forth between the different activities here. We can see the one sweat drop as opposed to the other two that aren't filled in quite yet. We can make a fair assumption that means that it's less strenuous than some other activities in there, because an activity could go up to 3 dots. And generally, we like to think that it's aesthetically pleasing. The things that pop out, the high contrast colors are important, and hopefully we pull off intuitive and aesthetically pleasing in this.
All right, so let's talk about the same thing from a slightly different direction and talk about perceptual variables. One of the things that had a great deal of influence on me was learning early in my career some of the lessons that were formalized by Jacques Bertin, who was a famous French cartographer and teacher to the last two generations in France. And early in his career, around 1967-68, Bertin developed a system which is known as, which he called the visual variables for quantitative information. He was focusing at that time really on educating people who were doing maps and diagrams, print, and he formalized these 7 variables as essentially the atoms, the material, sort of the primary material that you use to communicate differences when you're doing maps and diagrams. So I'm going to run through them fairly fast just to give you a sense of where they stand, and we'll see how they relate to some of the other concepts of perceptual variables. On the left is the original explanation, visual explanation that Bertin put together. On the right is a more recent one done by another professor, Benoit Martin. So the first visual variable is position, the point, where a point sits on a two-dimensional plane. That seems fairly obvious, and obviously it's quite important for geographical information, but it's only one of those elements. The next element is size, so we can have a mark, and that mark can have different sizes. The third is the value, and he uses the term value here. We're not talking about the color itself, but we're talking about the shade of the color, the intensity of the color that's being used on the mark. These are the variables of the image. The differential variables for the image, he includes grain, something that isn't used that much anymore for shading a pattern inside of a shape. Color, now here we're talking about the actual hue that's being used, not the intensity of it. Orientation, which essentially means the position of something. So if we've got it in terms of lines can be vertical, horizontal, or diagonal. If we've got some kind of a shape that has sides, it can be rotated one way or another. And then, of course, we have shape. And when we talk about shape, we generally speak about the primary shapes: circle, triangle, square, or rectangle. There's many other kinds of shapes, but it's much more difficult for you to quickly perceive differences in shapes that are not primary. So let me just use these 2 examples to also illustrate another aspect of these 7 variables, that each of them has a carrying capacity. If you think of it in terms of electronics or a computer, you think of it as the bandwidth of the variable itself. And we're going to focus here on color because it's often the easiest one to look at. The example on the left is a diagram that shows the high-speed train network in France, and the chromatic scale on the bottom is 7 different colors that are blended into one another in a continuous sequence. The dark blue represents the shortest, and all the blues represent the shortest amount of time, and the hotter color, the reds and the yellows, represent the longer amount of time. And you can very quickly see how much of the country is covered by a short amount of time, 2.5 hours, and how small an area it takes. It actually takes 5, 6, even 7 hours to reach. On contrast, on the right, you've got the metro map for the city of Paris, and the city of Paris has over 20 different lines. Now, color is being used here to represent the different lines, and it's quite literally impossible for you to recognize how many different colors there are and how many different lines there are. But when you focus on an individual portion of the map, it still works.
Okay, so whereas Bertin identified these perceptual variables very early on, in more recent years, psychologists have taken to coming to understand which of these variables we're good at understanding and which we're not so good at understanding. And one of the more interesting ones came from Cleveland and McGill in '84, where they really identified, based on these 10 variables, what we're good at and what we're not so good at. For instance, so we're good at in the top left corner, coming down to the bottom right. So position on a common scale, we're quite good at understanding and length. We can tell the difference between two lines very easily. From the flip side, we're not so good at telling the difference between different shades or different curvature. We wouldn't know whether that's a difference between a 35-degree arc and a 40-degree arc. So that wouldn't be good for conveying data unless there's a big difference, that threshold, that noticeable difference. And color is particularly interesting because we're not very good at telling the difference between, say, different oranges. That one orange is 2% more orange than something else. It's not a good way of conveying data. But if you were comparing, say, something that's orange and something blue, like in the France example, that's a little more stark. So we have to rely on the things that we're good at and avoid those things we're not so good at. And Cleveland McGill really gave us that start. So coming back to the example that we gave in the very beginning. So first off, for those who didn't find the red circle in the beginning, here it is. Now, I talked earlier about conjoint variables. So here we have just two variables, essentially, color and shape. But let's add in a third variable, size. And what I've done is gone and made the circle much bigger on all of these. And obviously, the circle pops on all three of these, even the forget about it example. That's because it stands out more. We're change detectors. So when you have a situation where two variables may not cut it, perhaps it's time to add that third variable in order to make the interface or the visualization more intuitive.
And we'll see in almost all the design examples that when we speak about these variables, the kind of atomic particles, it's rare that you're working with only one, and that it's the craft that you need to understand how to control combinations, the conjoined variables, as Dan says, that really makes the design tremendously effective.
Yeah, and it's those conjoined variables that in the top example hinder our visual system and our psychological system, but in the bottom, they help it out by, again, making it pop. So a very basic visualization is the graph, one that we're all very familiar with. And let's break this down a little bit. What are we looking at? We're looking at the length of lines. We're looking at the shading of the background, the general area of the line, the slope and orientation of the line. And you may not have thought about all of these little atomic particles when looking at a graph, but that's why we have these graphs, because they're so easy to interpret. Now coming back to the learning aspect of this, we can see that the gray and white background are different for some reason, and it would take a moment's notice to see that, okay, gray is good. It's a desirable area, even though it's on the top or the bottom based on the figure, whether it's HDL or cholesterol and so forth. So even the very basic visualization of a graph, we break it down and see why we use these graphs, because they are quite intuitive.
Yeah, and I've filled in parentheses the names for these variables in Preattentive system. You know, when we're talking about length, we are talking about size. When we're talking about the slope of the line, you can quickly see that either this is going up or this is going down. We're talking about orientation. I also wanted to pull this example from Joel Katz's very interesting Designing Information book to bring this back to the preattentive variables that Dan had mentioned before. So this list on the left, these are the preattentive variables, the things that you perceive without thinking. And the three that we've highlighted in red here are the ones that allow you to make the distinction we have on the diagram on the right. What Katz has done is he's come up with 4 different ways of representing the difference between Unit 1, Unit 10, and Unit 100. And what he's trying to show you here is that he's using color in all all four of these cases to make the distinction, but your ability to perceive the relative value of 1, 10, and 100 is clearly stronger in some of these representations as a point, as a line, as a plane, and as a solid than it is in others. So, one of the things that you can conclude from this is that your ability to see the difference in line length is more refined or quicker. This relative size and line length are two of the perceptual variables we have over on the left, and that, as we're going to explain now in some other examples, your ability to see the difference in area of the square is actually a bit more refined or quicker than your ability to see the difference in area in the circles. And in the case of the solids, it's just the third dimension doesn't really add to your ability to see it.
Which is why no one likes 3D graphs. So, and also along these lines, different variables are good at conveying different types of information. So, in this example, color is being used to give us categorical differences between 1, 10, and 100. It wouldn't be so good at conveying ordinal differences, or even so that's why we have the lines and other things to convey ordinal as opposed to categorical information.
This example is often reproduced, so I thought it would be interesting to bring in here. Historically, the person who pioneered visual representations of data is a man named William Playfair, and he was operating in both the United Kingdom and in France at the turn of the 19th century. This illustration, which many people have used in their slide presentations, is from a book from 1801, and what it represents is written out much larger here. It's hard to read in the lovely cartouche at the top. This is a statistical chart showing the extent of population and revenue for each of the nations of Europe. So we can easily see that there's something is much bigger on the left and smaller on the right. It's a little more difficult to see what the differences in color in these lines represent. But essentially the line on the left represented the population of that empire, and the line on the right represented the revenues. You can't actually immediately see where the United Kingdom is, but they're the ones with the highest revenue over here on the right. One of the odd things about this type of representation is that by combining some of these things, you often create misinformation. Playfair was also pretty good at doing that. And one of the most prominent things about this diagram is you notice the slope of the line connecting the red vertical line and the yellow vertical line. That information is actually misinformation, since the slope of that line depends on the size of the land mass, and it has nothing to do with the difference between the revenue and the population. So there's some general rules. Many of us have preferences or attitudes or arguments about whether we should use bar charts or pie charts or line graphs for certain types of representations, but there's some things that can't be argued about in terms of perceptual variables. Using area to represent quantity, as you see on the left, has its disadvantages. Using length to represent quantity, as you see on the right, has its advantages. As we've said, length is something that we pick up as a preattentive variable, and one of the reasons why using different circles to represent it, or pies, which is essentially using angles to represent quantity, is difficult, is that our natural systems tend to compare length rather than comparing area. So as you see on the right, when you look at those two circles, you essentially compare their diameter rather than their area, which is not the same proportion as the area that's being represented. Again, these are taken from Alvaro Caro's recent book.
So bringing this to an example that we've created here at MadPow, these were two different ways of conveying some data for one of our clients. The one on the left is a little bit more aesthetically pleasing and interesting, as opposed to the one on the left, which basically just conveys the data. And the client rightfully went with the one on the right because it essentially conveys the data in a much more efficient manner. The one on the left, we would really have to stare at a little bit in order to compare the areas of those polygons. And they are these five-sided or They are four-sided, but they're not quite squares or rectangles. So it would be a little harder to parse which one is bigger than the other one, as opposed to the line graphs where we can just take a look at that and know that chronic care is the biggest and that diet and stress are fairly close to each other, that sort of thing. So again, you want to convey the data in such a way that you don't have to make the folks think about it. So we're going to quickly go through the Gestalt laws and principles, and these are the laws and principles that really tie together all of these atomic variables, the visual variables. And the Gestalt laws are a way of looking at it from that bottom-up way. The principles are looking at the same thing, but a little differently in a top-down kind of way. And these are the things that tie the variables together. So very quickly, the first three Gestalt laws: closure, similarity, and proximity. If you look at the examples on the right side, in our mind's eye for closure, we can see that upside down triangle based on the other information available. Same with the IBM logo. We don't need to have those lines filled in. Our fill gets filled in our mind's eye. So same with similarity. We're going to group these items together in our mind's eye. This is that whole change detection. The example there is the word toolbar, where we know that the gray and the beige are going to be grouped together based on the background color. And that makes it very simple, very intuitive. Proximity: when things are close together, they're grouped together in our mind's eye, and that's how we're able to read as humans, to know the difference between paragraphs and the difference between words. Moving on from there, the law of common fate, where items that are grouped together or moved together are grouped together. Again, it all comes back to grouping and noticing these changes. Continuity, where an overlapping item is perceived as one continuous item. The example here on the left, we're not going to see this as something that goes from the top to the bottom and makes a little indentation. We're going to see it as two continual lines. And then symmetry. We perceive things as symmetrical wholes. On the right side, we don't see 6 little brackets. We see 3 complete brackets. In our mind's eye, we're going to want to complete that symmetry, which is why symmetrical items tend to be aesthetically pleasing. And then finally, figure grounds. The difference between the figure and the ground are very important when perceiving. The basis for a lot of optical illusions with Escher and the impossible box. And then Delaney's example.
Right. The example down on the bottom is by a Swiss artist, Felice Farini. This is actually a photograph that was taken a couple of weeks ago. This is an exhibition at the Grand Palais in Paris. And what Varini's exceptionally good at is creating these anamorphic images that once you're in the appropriate position, the image essentially comes together in your mind, pops out, and creates these remarkable visual impressions. On the right, you see that he's actually created this by painting portions of it in different positions within that corridor, and then if you stand at the end of the corridor, the image appears.
And these laws are the bottom-up way of looking at it, looking at the perceptual variables and seeing how they come together in the mind's eye. The principles here are really the top-down way of looking at it. It's the way that our mind deals with all of these inputs. Emergence, there's basically just a series of splotches and dots on there, but if you look really closely, you can see the dog sniffing the ground. With invariance, they're all similar lines and circles and such, but we can see that they are essentially the same object, just in different orientations. Multi-stability, where based on how we look at it, we can see different things, the famous faces and vase example. So these are really putting the laws together in a top-down kind of way.
So let's finish it up with color use, just as a way of sort of tying this all together. This example is from Map of the Market, which is one of the great data visualizations been online for quite some time. And it's a good illustration of using red and green. These are the two most common contrasting colors Here, red represents loss of value and green represents gain of value in a 24-hour period. And so they're using color, but they're also using value. That is, the intensity of the color indicates whether it's lost more or less value. So you can quickly see over on the lower right some stocks that lost even more value than the others, or something that's very bright on the lower left, more green, has more value. And then they use the same color in the bar graph that's overlaid here. So, a simple way of thinking about color is that you can use color for a variety of purposes. This graph tries to show the 4 different things you could use color for: just a distinction, binary, qualitative difference, something getting better or worse, divergent, things that are more different, or sequential, something that's representing a quantity that's going from 1 to 10, for example. But color can also have a lot of cultural meaning. This famous example by Massimo Vannelli on the left is a map that was done for the New York subway system in 1972, and while it had a lot of innovation and has had a lot of represented a lot of innovation, has had a lot of influence in the design community, the general public rejected it after a couple of years. And there were a number of things about it that the general public didn't like, but the most easy to recognize thing here is that in this design, the water around New York is represented in the color brown. People were very offended by that. It's a good contrasting color for the design, but it had some meaning that really bothered people. The same design over on the right has been re-implemented. Most recently, it's used in the Weekender. And in the case of Weekender, you'll see that he's changed the color of the background and made it much easier for you to see the individual elements. This example from some work that we did here at MadPow also shows, say, 2 or 3 levels of using color for calling things out. In this case, we're looking at a performance report for a hospital. At the first level, you simply want to know which ones of these are good and which ones of these are bad or problems. So you might first scan for the difference between the red and the green. And then in the interior of each one of those boxes, you've got a trend chart to give you an idea of just how good or how bad is it, and whether it's been bad for a long time or it's just recently gotten bad. So we're trying to design for your ability to perceive these things and to scan them in an order that uses as best we can the strengths of your System 1 perception.
And this example is a nice example of putting it all together because, as Paul mentioned, the red and the green, good and bad, stands out. But we've got columns, we've got rows that are associated with each other. We have interactions that are grouped together. Going back to putting common things together, we naturally will group things, and if we group things in an interface that are like, then it will be intuitive. Great. So, in summary, overall point here is to really rely on preattentive processing, on that System 1, in order to make things more intuitive and possibly more aesthetically pleasing. We want to guide people through the interaction. We want to rely on that System 1 so they don't really have to think about what that interaction should be and how to do it. And also in information visualization, it's that pattern seeking, it's that grouping that will make data pop and allow for those insights.
Yeah, and in so much of data visualization, we do want people to think. We're not trying to make you not think, but we're trying to support your thinking by drawing your attention to certain things, the things that you want to see, and also making it as easy as possible for you to compare one value against another, consider what move to make, consider what choice to make next.
And the whole goal here is to take advantage of the strengths of the mind and avoid those weaknesses, and I hope that we've pointed you towards some of those strengths and weaknesses in order to make your designs as intuitive as possible, and with the examples that we showed.
So thank you very much. And Courtney, do we have some questions that you would like us to answer?
We have some great questions. So when it comes to using software or getting involved in software interface design, what is your preference on using text on buttons rather than using icons on buttons? if you could give some examples of that, that would be great. And why would you choose text over icons or icons over text?
It's a good one. I'll dig in, and if you disagree, let me know.
I'll fight with you. Go ahead.
Okay, good. I think it comes back to the learned with the icons, because for novel interactions, I think text may be the way to go. Of course, if you have the real estate to do so, because by introducing a new icon, you are necessarily going to make someone learn. As opposed to some of the standard icons that we've been using for years, even though a save icon has nothing to do with a floppy disk anymore. That's still
What's a floppy disk?
Yeah, exactly. But it depends on the real estate that you have. If this is something that people are going to be using over and over again, that they'll quickly learn, or something that they're going to be using not that often, text may be the way to go, and always use tooltips. That always helps.
Yeah. Man, I don't have any particular disagreement with it. I do think that there was a trend maybe a decade ago to go rather overboard with icons for everything, as though software interfaces needed to become rebuses. And while there is certainly a value to having some visual symbolism that you associate with the program, more often than not, judicious use of text to draw someone through a particular process is the best approach. There's a limited visual vocabulary that's really appropriate for interaction icons.
It'll be much quicker to read the word save than to interpret the icon.
Great. Another question is, where can you learn more about these topics? Do you have any courses or good reads that you guys recommend?
Tons. And actually, at the very end of this presentation, which will be posted, there's a lot of references. Actually, I should have went right to it. We'll go to it here.
Well, a couple of books that I would recommend that I've used recently, so these are current books that are easy to find. Alberto Caro's book, The Functional Art, is very interesting. His focus is not user interface design. His focus is information graphics. He's a real master of design for data journalism, but there's many things that can be learned from that book. He's done a wonderful job of pulling things together. Joel Katz's recent book, Designing Information, is also a wonderful repository and really designed for people who are doing visual design of a variety of styles. So I would recommend those two.
And the Colin Ware book is a great one. It's a big old textbook, but it really does speak very clearly to all of this as to what the variables are, how to put them together, how to make those data visualizations. As far as the System 1, System 2, and Preattentive, it doesn't necessarily have to do with interface design, but Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, which came out a few years, is really bringing the idea of preattentive processing to pop culture, for lack of a better term. Great read. And finally, the link I have here for Chris Healy's website, Perception and Visualization, is a very lengthy, very informative website where I got all of the forget about it pictures. So that goes into Preattentive in great depth if you really want to geek out on this stuff.
Yeah, and as a non-cognitive psychologist, speaking for myself, Healy is a great resource. He, as an academic master, he's done a tremendous job of summarizing not just his own work or work that he particularly agrees with, but has done a tremendous job of summarizing the work in the field, and is a great place to go.
Great. Well, looks like we have enough time for one more question. What is the thought on changing font size to differentiate for the user, an active user versus an inactive selection? So it's kind of so changing the font size to differentiate between the user as an active user versus an inactive selection.
I guess I would caution a little bit about that, because that would involve a little bit of thinking. What does that mean? I think one of the standard here is to gray out as opposed to have it highlighted. Plus, with font size, It would have to be a great difference in font size for it to be a noticeable difference. If you only had like a point difference between the two, someone may really have to stare at it in order to see the difference. And then they would have to interpret that. So what does that mean? What does the bigger one versus the smaller one mean? You may want to go with something more standard, such as graying it out or highlighting.
Yeah, and in agreeing with that, there is a rule, one of these rules of thumb in typography that isn't attributed to anybody because it's been learned over hundreds of years, that when you're dealing with type in particular, if you want to make a distinction, you often have to make a distinction at two levels. So to simply take something in one font in 10 point and put it next to the same font in 11 point or even 12 point, it will be difficult for people to distinguish that difference. If you place something in 10 point next to something in 12 point in bold, it's more likely that they will see that difference. So, when you're working with type as the differentiator, working with size of type, you often have to exaggerate that size difference for it to be perceived.
And that goes back to the conjoint variables conversation we had earlier. You got to add in another variable in order to make it intuitive and pop out.
Great. Well, it looks like that is all for time and everyone's fabulous questions. Thanks to everyone for coming today. We hope that you were able to take away a few great points and principles and implement in your current projects. If you have any questions, feel free to contact webinars at madpow.net, Dan Berlin or Paul Kahn. I'm sure they'll be happy to share their information with you as well. And I'll turn it over to them to give their information if you guys want more information.
Yeah, thanks for joining, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this. This is Dan, by the way, and my email address is dberlin@madpow.net or at Vanderlin on Twitter.
And I want to thank you all for joining us today, Paul, and my email address is pkahn, that's P-K-A-H-N, at madpow.net, and I honestly don't remember what my Twitter handle is, but
At Paul David Kahn.
At Paul David Kahn. You can find me. So thank you all very much for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys.